The bright morning sun streamed through the airport's massive windows as a young boy walked quietly beside his nanny through the bustling terminal of Kennedy International Airport. At just 11 years old, he carried himself with an unexpected grace, pulling his small navy blue suitcase while clutching his favorite book about airplanes. "Did you remember to pack your homework, dear?" his nanny asked, her gentle voice carrying the warmth of someone who had been with the family for years. The boy nodded, patting his backpack. He was wearing a simple red t-shirt and jeans, nothing that screamed wealth, exactly how his father wanted it. His father, one of the most successful businessmen in the aviation industry, had always taught him that true character wasn't about showing off what you had. "Money doesn't make the man," he would often say, "your actions do." That's why today, like many other days, the boy was traveling with his nanny while his father attended to business matters. As they approached the Sterling Airways first-class check-in counter, the boy couldn't help but smile. Every time he flew, he felt a special kind of pride, not because of the luxury, but because he knew how hard his father had worked to build this airline from nothing. Of course, very few people knew that his father owned the majority stake in Sterling Airways. His dad preferred to keep things quiet, teaching his son the value of humility. The check-in process went smoothly, and soon they were making their way through security. The boy watched in fascination as the TSA agents worked, always curious about every aspect of air travel. His nanny noticed his interest and smiled, remembering how he could name almost every type of commercial aircraft by the time he was 7. Walking to their gate, they passed by various airline staff members. Some nodded politely, not knowing they were greeting the owner's son. The boy liked it this way, being treated just like everyone else. His father had always said, "Everyone deserves the same respect, whether they're cleaning the planes or flying them." At the gate, the first-class passengers were called for boarding. The boy and his nanny gathered their belongings and joined the line. He clutched his boarding pass tightly, excited about the window seat he had chosen. The gate agent smiled warmly as she scanned their tickets, and they made their way down the jet bridge. As they stepped onto the plane, the familiar smell of fresh cabin air greeted them. The boy loved this moment. The first step into an aircraft always felt magical to him. He could identify every detail, from the specific model of the overhead bins to the pattern on the seats. After all, he had spent countless hours studying everything about his father's airline. They found their seats in the spacious first-class cabin, 2A and 2B. The boy took the window seat, carefully placing his backpack under the seat in front of him, just as the safety rules required. His nanny helped him buckle his seatbelt, though he could have done it himself. He was independent that way, but he didn't mind when she fussed over him a little. Other passengers filed past them, filling up the first-class cabin. A businessman in an expensive suit gave them a curious glance, but quickly returned to his phone call. A couple with matching designer luggage settled in across the aisle, barely noticing the young boy, who was now eagerly watching the ground crew through his window. Little did anyone know that this routine first-class flight was about to become anything but ordinary. As the flight attendants began their pre-flight preparations, no one could have predicted how the next few hours would unfold, or how one person's prejudiced assumptions would lead to a moment that would change not just one airline, but an entire industry's approach to equality. The boy sat there, innocent and unaware of what was to come, simply happy to be flying on one of his father's planes, watching as the morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac. The plane was almost ready for takeoff when one of the flight attendants made her way through the first-class cabin. She'd been with Sterling Airways for 15 years, and something about seeing a young boy in first class didn't sit right with her. She'd seen her share of entitled passengers, but a child traveling in the premium section without visible parents raised her suspicions. As she moved through her pre-flight checks, she kept glancing at the boy and his nanny. The boy was quietly reading his book about airplanes, while his nanny arranged their things for the flight. "Ticket, please," the flight attendant said sharply, despite having already seen their boarding passes scanned at the gate. The nanny reached into her bag and produced both their tickets. "Is there a problem?" she asked politely, noticing this was the third time they'd been asked to show their tickets since boarding. The flight attendant examined the tickets with unusual scrutiny, holding them up to the light as if checking for counterfeits. "These seats are quite expensive," she said, her voice carrying a hint of disbelief. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" The boy looked up from his book, confusion crossing his face. He'd flown first class many times before, but no one had ever questioned his right to be there. Other passengers began to notice the interaction. A kind-looking elderly woman across the aisle frowned at the flight attendant's tone, while a businessman 2 rows ahead turned around to watch the scene unfold. The nanny maintained her composure, explaining calmly that yes, these were indeed their assigned seats. The flight attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, we'll see about that," she muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. She moved away, but continued to watch them closely as she went about her duties. Every few minutes, she'd walk past their row, making unnecessary adjustments to the overhead bins or checking seat belts that were already properly fastened. The boy tried to return to his book, but he could feel the flight attendant's eyes on him. His nanny squeezed his hand reassuringly, and he gave her a small smile. He remembered what his father always told him about staying calm in difficult situations. "Your dignity is not determined by how others treat you, but by how you respond." As the plane reached cruising altitude, the boy began to feel sleepy. The early morning start was catching up with him, and he noticed other passengers receiving pillows and blankets for comfort. Gathering his courage, he pressed the call button to request a pillow. The same flight attendant appeared almost immediately. "Yes," she said, her tone making the simple words sound like an accusation. "Could I please have a pillow?" the boy asked politely. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed. "I just saw you take one from the empty seat behind you," she said firmly. The boy blinked in surprise. "No, ma'am, I haven't taken any pillow," he replied truthfully. His nanny started to speak up, but the flight attendant cut her off. "I know what I saw," she insisted, her voice rising. Several passengers were now openly watching the exchange. "Please check the seat behind us," the boy suggested quietly. "You'll see I haven't taken any." The tension in the first-class cabin reached its peak as the boy stood up slightly, trying to show the flight attendant his empty hands. "Ma'am, I really haven't taken any pillow. You can check." His words were cut short by a sharp, sudden sound that echoed through the cabin. The flight attendant had done the unthinkable. She had slapped the young boy across his face. Time seemed to freeze. The boy's hand slowly rose to his cheek, more shocked than hurt. His nanny jumped to her feet, phone already in hand. "I'm calling his father right now," she announced, her usually gentle voice sharp with anger. The entire first-class cabin erupted in gasps and protests. "Did you just hit a child?" A businessman stood up from his seat, his voice filled with disbelief. The elderly woman across the aisle had her hand pressed to her mouth in horror. Several passengers had their phones out, recording the aftermath of the incident. The flight attendant seemed to realize what she had done. Her face paled, and her hand trembled as she took a step back. "He was being disrespectful," she stammered, but her words were drowned out by the outrage of the surrounding passengers. "I want your employee number," demanded a woman in a business suit. "This is absolutely unacceptable." Another passenger was already pressing their call button repeatedly, summoning other crew members. The boy remained remarkably composed, though his eyes had filled with tears he refused to let fall. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Your response to injustice shows your true character." He took a deep breath and sat back down, his hand still resting on his cheek. The lead flight attendant rushed to the scene, quickly assessing the situation as multiple passengers explained what had happened at once. "She hit him. She slapped the child. We all saw it." The voices overlapped in an angry chorus. The offending flight attendant tried to defend herself, her voice growing increasingly desperate. "You don't understand. He was lying about the pillow. He doesn't belong in first class. I was just. Her excuses were cut short by the lead flight attendant's stern voice. Return to the galley immediately, the lead flight attendant ordered. Turning to the boy and his nanny, she spoke softly. I am so deeply sorry. We're going to handle this situation right now. Are you all right? The boy nodded bravely, while his nanny continued her phone call, speaking quietly but urgently. The plane, which had been cruising at 35,000 feet, suddenly began a gradual turn. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, due to an incident on board, we will be returning to our departure airport. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. A mix of reactions rippled through the cabin. Some passengers were frustrated about the delay, but most were nodding in approval. The businessman who had spoken up earlier leaned towards the boy. You're being very brave, young man. What that lady did was completely wrong. The nanny finished her call and put a protective arm around the boy. Your father will be waiting when we land, she whispered to him. She turned to the lead flight attendant. His father will want to speak to your supervisor immediately upon landing. The offending flight attendant, now isolated in the galley, had no idea that her actions had just set in motion events that would reshape airline policy across the industry. She couldn't have known that the quiet, dignified boy she had just struck was the son of the airline's owner. As the plane began its descent back to the airport, passengers continued to share looks of disbelief and anger. Some were still recording, while others offered kind words to the boy. Through it all, he maintained the quiet dignity his father had taught him, though his cheek still stung from the slap. The morning sun now lit up the entire cabin as the plane banked towards the airport. In less than 30 minutes, everyone on board would witness something they'd never forget. A lesson in power, prejudice, and the price of making assumptions. The boy looked out the window, watching the clouds pass by, knowing his father would make this right, not just for him, but for everyone. The plane touched down smoothly, but the atmosphere inside was anything but calm. Police cars and airport security vehicles were already waiting on the tarmac, their lights flashing in the morning sun. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, passengers could see a small group of people in suits standing by the terminal, including a tall, distinguished-looking man in an impeccably tailored Navy suit. Inside the cabin, the offending flight attendant remained in the galley, her face ashen as she filled out incident reports with trembling hands. The lead flight attendant had already collected statements from nearby passengers, many of whom were still shaking their heads in disbelief at what they'd witnessed. Look at how he's handling this, whispered the elderly woman to her seatmate, nodding toward the boy. Such grace under pressure. Indeed, the young boy sat quietly, reading his airplane book again, though anyone watching closely could see he hadn't turned a page in several minutes. His nanny kept her hand on his shoulder, a gesture of both comfort and protection. She had been texting updates to the boy's father, who had immediately left an important board meeting upon hearing what happened. Everything will be okay now, she assured the boy softly. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at the gate. Please remain seated until further notice. We have some officials who need to board the aircraft first. Within minutes, the aircraft door opened, and several people entered the cabin. First came 2 air marshals, followed by the airline's chief of customer service. But it was the last person to board who caught everyone's attention, the distinguished man in the Navy suit. The offending flight attendant emerged from the galley, straightening her uniform nervously. Her face froze as she watched the man in the Navy suit walk directly to the boy's seat. Son, he said softly, kneeling beside him, are you all right? The boy nodded, finally letting his composure slip a little as he hugged his father. The airline owner stood up, his face calm, but his eyes blazing with controlled anger. He turned to address the entire cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption to your journey. I'm the owner of Sterling Airways, and this is my son. A murmur of surprise rippled through the cabin. The flight attendant's knees buckled slightly, and she had to grab the seat next to her for support. "What happened today," the owner continued, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin, "is unacceptable on every level. Not just because the child who was struck was my son, but because no child, no person, should ever be treated this way." Passengers nodded in agreement, some recording this moment on their phones. The businessman who had spoken up earlier was smiling with satisfaction. The elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "I want to thank those of you who spoke up and stood against this injustice," the owner went on. "Your actions remind us that we all have a responsibility to oppose discrimination and protect one another." He turned to face the flight attendant, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. But instead of the angry outburst everyone expected, his voice remained measured and professional. "We will handle this situation through the proper channels. For now, you are suspended pending a full investigation." The air marshal stepped forward to escort the flight attendant off the plane. As she passed the boy's seat, she tried to speak, but no words came out. The owner held up his hand, stopping her attempt at an apology. "We'll discuss this later in a more appropriate setting." Addressing the passengers again, he announced, "We'll have a new flight crew here shortly. Everyone in this cabin will be receiving full refunds for their tickets, and I personally invite you all to be my guests on the next flight out." The tension in the cabin finally began to ease. The owner sat down next to his son, speaking to him quietly. Several passengers could see him gently touching the boy's cheek where he had been struck, his face showing a father's concern rather than an airline owner's authority. As the new crew began to board the plane, passengers watched the interaction between father and son with renewed interest. They were witnessing not just the aftermath of an unfortunate incident, but the beginning of what would become a significant moment in airline history, though none of them knew just how far-reaching the consequences would be. The following morning, the airline owner sat in his office, reviewing the viral videos of the incident that had spread across social media overnight. Despite efforts to handle the situation quietly, passengers' recordings had already gathered millions of views. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. News outlets, civil rights organizations, and industry leaders all wanted to comment on the incident. He looked at the framed photo on his desk, showing him and his son in front of their first purchased aircraft. His mind wandered to his own struggles climbing the corporate ladder, the subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination he faced before finally buying and transforming a struggling regional airline into Sterling Airways. A gentle knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant entered with the morning's press reports. "Sir, the flight attendant is here for the meeting," she said softly. He nodded, straightening his tie as he stood. "Send her in, please, and make sure we're not disturbed." The flight attendant who entered his office looked markedly different from the confident crew member of yesterday. Her uniform was gone, replaced by a conservative business suit. Her hands clutched her purse tightly, and her eyes were red from what appeared to be a sleepless night. "Please, sit down," the owner gestured to a chair. She perched nervously on its edge, clearly expecting to be fired, or worse. But the owner's next words surprised her. "Before we discuss yesterday's events, I'd like to tell you a story," he began, his voice calm. 20 years ago, I was removed from a first-class cabin because the crew didn't believe my ticket was real. I was already a successful businessman, but that didn't matter. They saw what they wanted to see. The flight attendant's eyes widened as she listened. The owner continued, "I could have sued the airline. Instead, I decided to buy it and change it from within. That's how Sterling Airways began." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Yesterday, you did to my son what was done to me all those years ago. The only difference is, he's just a child." His voice carried no anger, only a deep sadness. The flight attendant began to cry silently. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I don't know why I've never done anything like that before. I've worked here for 15 years. 15 years, the owner repeated thoughtfully. That's a long time to build a career, and just a moment to destroy it. He stood and walked to his office window, looking out at the airfield where planes took off and landed in perfect sequence. "I've received dozens of calls demanding your termination," he continued. "They're expecting me to make an example of you. But firing you would be easy. For me, and in some ways, for you too. You'd find another job, perhaps feel bitter, and nothing would really change." He turned back to face her. "Instead, I'm going to offer you a choice. You can resign right now, walk away, and we never speak of this again." He paused, studying her reaction. "Or you can help me change this airline, and maybe this industry, from the inside out." The flight attendant looked up, confused. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "We're creating a new department focused on diversity and inclusion training. Every employee, from baggage handlers to board members, will go through it. If you choose to stay, you'll work with civil rights organizations, share your story, and help create training programs to prevent this from happening again." He sat back down at his desk. "It won't be easy. You'll need to face your own biases, speak publicly about your mistakes, and work harder than you ever have. The choice is yours." The flight attendant sat in stunned silence. Of all the outcomes she'd imagined, this wasn't one of them. Through her tears, she saw the photo on his desk, father and son standing proudly before their aircraft. She thought about her own 15-year journey with the airline, and the young boy she'd struck in a moment of unchecked prejudice. The morning sun streamed through the office windows, illuminating particles of dust floating in the air, as she prepared to make a decision that would not only affect her future, but potentially the future of airline service across the country. The owner waited patiently, knowing that true change often begins in moments exactly like this one. 2 weeks had passed since the incident. The flight attendant sat in a small conference room, surrounded by diversity trainers and civil rights advocates. Her hands trembled slightly as she took notes, but her eyes showed determination. She had chosen the harder path, to stay and become part of the solution. "Remember your first day back?" asked one of the trainers kindly. Indeed, she did. Walking into the airline's training center had been one of the hardest moments of her life. Every eye had been on her, some judgmental, others curious. But the owner had been there, introducing her not as the person who made a terrible mistake, but as someone brave enough to help create change. Today's session focused on unconscious bias in the service industry. As examples of discrimination were discussed, she found herself speaking up more and more. "I never thought I was prejudiced," she admitted to the group. "I had friends from different backgrounds. I thought that was enough. But now I see how many assumptions I was making without even realizing it." Meanwhile, in the owner's office, a different kind of meeting was taking place. Representatives from other major airlines had gathered to discuss the incident and its implications for the industry. The owner's response had caught everyone's attention, not for its harshness, but for its innovative approach to addressing discrimination. "Our new training program starts next month," the owner explained, pointing to presentation slides. "We're calling it Sky for All. Every employee, from top to bottom, will participate." He clicked to the next slide, showing statistics about discrimination in air travel. This isn't just Sterling Airways' problem. It's an industry problem. Back in the training room, the flight attendant was sharing her story with a group of new hires. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "I thought I was just doing my job, being vigilant. But I was really just acting on prejudices I didn't even know I had. It took a child's dignity to show me how wrong I was." The new employees listened intently. One raised her hand. "Weren't you afraid you'd be fired? Or worse?" The flight attendant nodded. "I was terrified. But the owner showed me something important, that making real change is better than just punishing people." Throughout the building, similar conversations were happening. In the crew lounges, flight attendants discussed how to handle difficult situations without making assumptions. In management offices, executives reviewed policies about passenger profiling. Even in the maintenance hangars, Workers attended workshops about creating an inclusive environment. The owner's son had returned to flying, still in first class, still carrying his beloved book about airplanes. But now flight attendants across the airline knew him, not as the owner's son, but as the boy whose quiet dignity had sparked a movement. Late that afternoon, the flight attendant found herself in the same galley where she had once isolated herself after the incident. But this time, she was training a group of crew members on new service guidelines. "Remember," she said, "every passenger deserves respect. Every single one." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the airport terminals, the owner stood at his office window again. On his desk lay proposals from 5 other airlines, all wanting to implement similar training programs. His phone buzzed with messages from industry leaders seeking advice on transformation. He picked up his son's latest school photo. The boy was smiling broadly, showing no trace of the incident that had changed so many lives. "Your grandpa always said everything happens for a reason," he murmured to himself. Maybe he was right. A knock on his door announced the arrival of the flight attendant, carrying her latest training report. Her uniform was back on, worn now with a different kind of pride. "Sir," she said, "we finished the first phase of crew training. The response has been overwhelming." The owner smiled, gesturing for her to sit. "Tell me more," he said, genuinely interested. As she began to share the day's successes and challenges, both of them knew they were part of something bigger than themselves, a real change in how people were treated in the skies. Outside, planes continued to take off and land, carrying thousands of passengers from all walks of life. But now, each flight carried something else too. The promise of a more respectful, inclusive future in air travel, born from a moment of prejudice transformed into an opportunity for change. 3 months after the incident, the flight attendant stood nervously behind the curtain at a major airline industry conference. The room was packed with executives, crew members, and media representatives from around the world. She could hear the owner finishing his introduction speech. And now, his voice carried through the speakers. "I'd like to introduce someone who has become an unexpected catalyst for change in our industry. Her story isn't just about a mistake. It's about the courage to face that mistake and turn it into something positive." Taking a deep breath, she walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, and hundreds of faces looked up at her. She spotted the owner's son sitting in the front row with his nanny, giving her an encouraging smile. That small gesture of forgiveness gave her the strength to begin. "6 months ago, I thought I knew everything about customer service," she started, her voice slightly shaky but growing stronger. "I had been flying for 15 years. I had won awards. I thought I was one of the good ones." She paused, looking across the audience. "I was wrong." As she shared her story, the room fell completely silent. She described her assumptions that day, her growing frustration, and the moment she lost control. "When I slapped that child," she said, her voice cracking, "I wasn't just striking him. I was striking at every person who had ever been judged unfairly, every passenger who had ever been profiled, every human being who had ever been made to feel less than worthy." In the audience, several people wiped away tears. Airline staff members nodded in recognition of situations they had witnessed, or, perhaps, caused themselves. The owner's son listened intently, still showing the same dignity he had displayed that day on the plane. "But this story isn't about what I did wrong," she continued, straightening her shoulders. "It's about what we can all do right." She clicked to her first presentation slide, showing the results of Sterling Airways' new training program. In just 3 months, passenger complaints about discrimination have dropped by 87%. Employee satisfaction has increased by 45%. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. She smiled at a group of flight attendants in the audience. "The real change is in how we see each other, crew and passengers alike." She shared stories from the training sessions. a ground crew member who realized he had been treating certain passengers differently without knowing it, a gate agent who found new ways to handle difficult situations without making assumptions, a first-class flight attendant who discovered her own hidden biases. The hardest part, she admitted, was looking in the mirror, really looking, seeing not just who I thought I was, but who I had become without realizing it, and then choosing to become someone better. The owner watched from the side of the stage, nodding approvingly. His gamble on transformation rather than punishment was paying off better than he had hoped. Other airlines were already adopting similar programs, and industry standards were beginning to change. Yesterday, the flight attendant continued, I served in first class for the first time since the incident. I was nervous, but I had learned so much. Every passenger I served, I saw as a whole person, not just a seat number, not just a ticket class, and certainly not just their appearance. She turned to look directly at the owner's son. I learned my most important lesson about service from an 11-year-old boy. He showed me that true dignity isn't about where you sit on the plane. It's about how you treat others, and how you respond when they mistreat you. As she concluded her speech, the audience rose in a standing ovation. The owner's son was the first to stand, followed by his father. The flight attendant felt tears in her eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude, for a second chance, for the opportunity to make things right, and for the chance to help others learn from her mistake. After the presentation, as people lined up to speak with her, she noticed a young boy about the same age as the owner's son, watching her curiously. She smiled at him, and in that simple gesture was all the change that had happened in the past 3 months. A smile that carried no judgment, no assumptions, just simple human kindness. The afternoon sun streamed through the conference center's windows, and somewhere overhead, planes continued their journeys, carrying passengers who would benefit from the lessons learned on that fateful day. 6 months had passed since the conference. The flight attendant now walked through airport terminals with a different kind of confidence. As the head of Sterling Airways' new passenger inclusion program, she carried the responsibility of transforming airline culture not just within their company, but across the industry. Today was special. She stood in the first-class cabin of a Sterling Airways flight, preparing for a unique training session. The cabin was filled not with passengers, but with flight attendants from various airlines. At the front of the cabin, a familiar face caught her eye. The owner's son, now 12, was there to help with the training. My father always says that change happens one person at a time, the boy began, addressing the group with remarkable poise for his age. The flight attendant felt a surge of emotion, remembering how different things had been just months ago in a cabin just like this one. The training session was unlike any other. Instead of lectures, they used role-play scenarios. The owner's son participated, helping demonstrate both good and bad interactions. The flight attendants practiced handling difficult situations, checking their assumptions, and treating every passenger with equal respect. Remember, the flight attendant explained, we're not just serving drinks and meals. We're creating experiences. Every interaction is a chance to make someone feel valued. She shared stories from her recent flights, including one about an elderly passenger who had been nervous about flying first class. Last week, this gentleman apologized for not looking like he belonged in first class, she told the group. 6 months ago, I might have agreed with him. Today, I told him that the only thing needed to belong in any class is a valid ticket and human dignity. The training participants nodded, some taking notes, others sharing their own experiences. One flight attendant raised her hand. But how do we handle security concerns without profiling? It was a question the flight attendant had once used to justify her own behavior. The owner's son spoke up. My father taught me something important, he said. Safety comes from good training and observation, not from assumptions. The flight attendant smiled, remembering how the owner had helped her understand the difference between security awareness and prejudice. During the lunch break, she found herself sitting with the boy in the same seats where their story had begun. "Do you ever get tired of telling our story?" she asked him. He thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Dad says sometimes the hardest stories are the ones that need to be told the most." The afternoon session focused on practical changes. The flight attendant demonstrated new greeting protocols, showing how to welcome every passenger with the same warmth regardless of their appearance or ticket class. They discussed body language, tone of voice, and the impact of small gestures. "Watch this," she said, demonstrating how she used to approach passengers versus how she did it now. The difference was subtle but significant. Less judgment, more openness. The owner's son played the role of various passengers, helping showcase how unconscious bias could affect even simple interactions. As the training day wound down, the flight attendant shared some impressive statistics. Customer satisfaction scores had soared across all cabin classes. Employee morale was at an all-time high. Other airlines were reporting similar improvements after implementing their version of the program. "But the numbers aren't the whole story," she said, gesturing to the boy. "The real success is in the stories we don't hear. The passengers who never have to feel unwelcome. The children who never have to face prejudice. The travelers who get to just be travelers." The setting sun cast a warm glow through the airplane windows as the training session concluded. Participants lingered, sharing their own stories and insights. The owner's son helped hand out completion certificates, each one representing a small step toward a more inclusive future in air travel. Looking around the cabin, the flight attendant felt a profound sense of purpose. The same space that had witnessed one of her worst moments had become a classroom for positive change. Each person leaving that training would touch hundreds of lives, creating a ripple effect of understanding and respect. As the last participants filed out, she straightened a few seats and smiled. Tomorrow, this same cabin would welcome actual passengers, and she knew that thanks to days like today, their experience would be better than ever before. 1 year had passed since that fateful day. Sterling Airways' main terminal was decorated for a special celebration, the first anniversary of their Sky for All program. Banners hung from the ceiling, and airline staff from across the country had gathered for the event. The terminal's main hall had been transformed into an event space. Photos lined the walls, showing moments from the past year, training sessions, happy passengers, diverse crew members working together. At the center was a large photo of the owner and his son, standing proudly beside their newest aircraft, painted with the Sky for All logo. The flight attendant, now wearing a blazer with the title Director of Inclusion Programs, stood backstage with the owner and his son. "Are you ready?" the owner asked them both. The boy, now a confident young teenager, nodded. His father straightened his tie, pride shining in his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice rang out, "please welcome our speakers." The crowd applauded as the three of them walked onto the stage. Camera flashes sparkled through the terminal. The owner spoke first. "1 year ago, an incident on one of our flights could have ended very differently. We could have responded with anger, with punishment, with headlines that would have faded in a few days." He paused, looking at his son. "Instead, we chose to learn, to grow, and to change." The flight attendant stepped forward next. "When I walked into the owner's office that morning, I expected to lose my job. Instead, I was given the chance to find my purpose." She gestured to the photos on the walls. "Look at what we've accomplished together." She shared the year's achievements. Over 10,000 airline staff trained across multiple carriers, passenger satisfaction at record highs, and most importantly, a complete shift in airline culture. "We're not just serving people anymore," she said. "We're honoring their dignity." The boy's turn came next. He spoke with the same quiet confidence he'd shown that difficult day. "My father always told me that true change starts with forgiveness," he said, smiling at the flight attendant. "But it doesn't end there. It continues with action." The crowd listened intently as he described his own role in the program, helping train staff while sharing his perspective. "Every time I fly now, he said. "I see something different. I see people being treated with respect, no matter who they are or what seat they're in." The owner returned to the podium, unveiling their next initiative. "Today, we're launching a scholarship program for underprivileged youth interested in aviation careers. Because diversity isn't just about who flies, it's about who works in every part of this industry." The flight attendant watched the faces in the crowd, remembering her own journey. She saw newer staff members who had never known the old way of doing things. She saw veteran crew who had transformed their approach to service. Most importantly, she saw hope for the future. After the speeches, as people mingled and shared stories, a young girl approached the flight attendant. "I want to be like you when I grow up," she said shyly. The flight attendant knelt down to her level. "Be better than me," she replied gently. "Learn from my mistakes, and make the sky even more welcoming for everyone." The owner's son joined them, offering the girl one of his model airplanes. "Maybe you'll own an airline someday," he said with a smile. His father watched from nearby, knowing that this moment, this simple, kind interaction, was the real measure of their success. As the evening drew to a close, the flight attendant found herself looking out the terminal windows at the planes taking off into the sunset. Each one carried more than just passengers. They carried the promise of respect, dignity, and equal treatment for all. The owner's son stood beside her, also watching the planes. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked quietly. She nodded, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Every day," she replied. "It reminds me that our worst moments can lead to our best changes, if we're brave enough to learn from them." Above them, planes continued their journeys across the darkening sky, each one a testament to how far they'd come, and a reminder of how far they could still go in making the skies truly welcoming for everyone.